Hey everyone, Joe Mazzolotti here, another episode in Test-Driven iOS. Here we're going to be getting started with learning how Cedar works and test driving our first class. It'll be a very simple bank account class, and we'll get into how we can assert some methods on that and some behavior there. So Cedar is a behavior-driven development style framework, and what that means is that we can nest things and declare a behavior around situations and set up contexts versus unit testing specific methods individually. So what that means in practice is that we, instead of getting methods like assert that balance equals 5, we have methods like add 1 to balance, add another 1 to balance, and then assert that it is 2. So different scenarios, more in the way that a user would interact with the app from an outside-in viewpoint. So what we have over here right now is I've set up a really simple project that has a couple files in it, a bank account class and a bank account spec. And all that's going on here is pretty bare bones Cedar, where we import Cedar, we import our class that we're under test, and we create some doubles and matchers, namespace references. We'll get into these later, we don't have to worry about them just yet. The important part is this outer describe. What this means is that we're describing a bank account. And this is really just for printing when we see our error messages and when we see our test failures later. It doesn't really mean too much except context for the user and serve as documentation. So here we're creating a block variable called subject. I like to use subject as the subject under test because it's consistent, keeps consistent throughout all of the files that we're going to be testing. We then have a beforeEach. Now beforeEach is run before all of the contexts and describes and if blocks that are inside underneath it in scope. We'll get into that more when we have nested scopes. But then we also have an it block. And this is the meat of Cedar here, are these it assertions. Here we're asserting that things should happen or should not happen or should behave in certain ways. So here we say it should exist, and we write our assertion that says subject should not be nil. And what this really means is, or what this is really doing, is that Cedar has a bunch of custom matchers. And a should not and a be nil worked together in unison to say that this subject does not equal nil and actually exists. And there are many more that we'll get into incrementally as these videos go on. So let's run these tests with Command U. And we'll see after this builds that we are passing already. So I took a little bit of liberty and started us off with a passing test just so we didn't start with a failure here. So in the vein of test driving this, we want to have one behavior on this, maybe two behaviors on this class. We want it to state our balance, and we want to be able to increment this balance by 1 unit. And maybe that's not the best scenario in terms of the real world, but let's start small and we can add on it later. So what we're going to do here is inside of our describe, we're going to have another describe. Call it the balance. And now we're going to say that when the object, or upon instantiation, it should be 0. And now we're going to say subject.balance should equal 0. There's another one of our matchers, an equal matcher. And now you notice that this doesn't even build. Command Shift U to build our specs says build failed, that balance is not found on bank account. Alright, there's our first good failure. It's not a failing test, but it's a failing to compile, which in my mind is just as good. So let's make that pass. Let's add a method called balance. And I'll pick an unsigned integer just so we can't go negative just yet. And let's run our tests again and see what happens. So we're saying, down here we'll see, that we encountered an exception. We passed 1 and had 1 exception. The balance upon instantiation should be 0. Bank account balance, it does not respond to that selector. So just because it's in the header does not mean it responds to it. So let's copy that method and add it down here into our implementation. And since we have a compile time, this has to return something. Let's just return 0 to start. Okay, And that passes both of our tests, so we can now move on to our next test. So upon instantiation, it should be 0. Let's have another describe here, describing more behavior. When incrementing the balance it should be 1. So here is now where we can start to get into how our beforeEaches and its and everything should work. So if I say here, before subject increment, and then down here say subject dot balance should equal 1. What's going on now? We have our outer describe that's describing the bank account. We have a beforeEach that's run before every single it inside of it. And then we have more describes down, and a context, and then another describe. So the order of execution here is that this beforeEach is run, then this beforeEach is run, and then this it is run. So for this it, only this beforeEach is run, and then this it directly. So you can see how it kind of flows down and inherits from what's above it, but those it blocks are not run. So when this assertion is being run, this is not run, that pass of all the specs. So that's something important to keep in mind. So back to our test failure, same thing as before, we do not have a method called increment. So let's create that method. And run our specs again. And we are running into the same problem where bank account increment does not really respond to it. So let's do that. And the simplest way to get this passing is to do absolutely nothing, or to get it building at least. And now we have a failure. So here we're seeing the balance, when incrementing the balance, should be 1. And on line 34, expected 0 to equal 1. Okay, let's fix that. Now we actually need a reference to a balance and to keep it in this class. So let's open a class extension here, and we'll do that through the helper. Interface extension, bank account, and let's actually have a property called balance. And now here we want to say self.balance plus plus. And try that again. And we're still failing because now this is not returning the right thing. This now needs to return self.balance. And unfortunately, that means that we're now in an infinite loop. So I'm going to stop that process. What's going on here is that we've declared a property called balance, and we're calling self.balance inside of a method called balance, which means that this is going to call self.balance, which is going to call itself, which is going to call itself, which is going to call itself. So let's change this property here to something that will only be used internally, something like account balance. And here, let's do that, and run these tests again. And there we go, three passes, no failures. So here's a very, very quick example of how to get started with Cedar and get some really simple tests running. My next video will talk about how to use some custom matchers and be able to balance through different types of expectations, not just on integers and should equals. If you need more information about installing Cedar, there's a link in the video notes, and you can follow me on Twitter at Joe Mazzolati. Have a great day.